Hi Claire, how are you? We are glad to have you to start our Learn to Check talks.
It's my pleasure. Lovely to be with you.
Okay, you have been studying disinformation and the evolution of this phenomena for many, many years. Which changes of disinformation in all this time are the more concerning?
So the biggest change over the last, about 10 years ago, most of the content we saw, there wasn't very much, and it was mostly hoaxes. It was silly. It was trying to see what people could get away with. And then about 5 years ago, we recognized how much of a problem this was, that there was a lot of misinformation, but a lot of it was actually false, obvious rumors, people creating websites with headlines that were completely false. And that was what we were thinking about in 2016. But now in 2020, there's been a recognition by bad actors that that kind of content gets either taken down by the platforms or demoted in the algorithmic newsfeed. So now we see more of misleading content that's just a bit confusing. There's a kernel of truth to it. If I Google it, I'm going to find something about it. And that's a deliberate technique because that kind of content is very difficult to take down. It's speech. It's not illegal. It's misleading. And so that makes it harder for us to make sense of this kind of content because people just say, well, I think there might be something to it. So that's been a big shift over the last 10 years.
The confirmation bias, the cognitive dissonance, we have a lot of aspects that make us vulnerable to disinformation. How can we escape our bias?
Well, unfortunately, as humans, we are wired to want to find and consume information that reinforces what we already think. Because it's kind of a survival mechanism that it's easier to believe that the way that we see the world is the correct way. So when information comes that challenges us, rather than say, oh, that's interesting, we're more likely to say, to resist that new information because it doesn't fit in our schema. And that doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. It doesn't matter if you're conservative or liberal. It doesn't matter if you're very highly educated or less educated. It affects everybody. And that's just a very human trait. So we have to be aware of that and think about the reaction we have when we see information. So when we see something and it makes us go, yeah, told you so. Or it makes us go, yeah, because the other side are idiots. That's when we have to think, hang on, this is my brain playing tricks on me. But that's hard. We have to get used to thinking about that because our brains are working against us when it comes to misinformation.
Mm-hmm. Conspirational thinking is growing, sometimes because we have no certainty of things, and this fits conspirational thinking. How can we, as a society, accept and communicate uncertainty?
So again, this goes back to kind of survival mechanisms. We want explanations for things. We want to understand why something is happening. And of course, this year, we didn't have answers to where did the coronavirus come from? We still don't. It took a long time for there to be consensus about whether or not masks work. Masks do work. Does airborne transmission, is that a problem? And so when you're searching for certainty, and you don't get it from science, you can get it from Google. Because if you go to Google, there are conspiracy theorists who will provide very simple, explanatory narratives, essentially. They are stories. Conspiracies are simple, powerful stories. And again, as humans, we love stories. And stories are not facts. Stories are something neat with a nice beginning and an end. And we are trained to love stories, and conspiracies are stories. And so the challenge is to, as society, to say, sometimes we can't have neat stories that you can tie up with a bow. That's not what the world is. The world is complex and messy and nuanced. And we have to be okay with that. And we have to recognize that conspiracies provide that. I mean, I don't think we do a good enough job of explaining, of course, a good conspiracy theory is seductive. Of course it is, because it's simple. And we need to, I think, be more aware of that rather than say, oh, people who believe conspiracies are stupid, they're crazy. That's not what, they're not stupid and crazy. All of us at times have believed some form of conspiracy. It's not just all flat earth. All of us have said, I think maybe there's something to that. So all of us are susceptible. And in 2020, or even this decade, people have been less secure financially. There are huge shifts geopolitically. People are feeling uncertain. Technology, this thing has made our lives turn upside down. So in that context, it's not surprising that we're seeking more explanation. And unfortunately, the best people at producing those explanations are often not using facts to support their explanations.
And sometimes people believe fakes or conspirational thinking because of isolation, anxiety, desperation, poor economic situation. Can we prevent them from believing in fakes only by providing them facts? Or should we attack these other causes that makes them vulnerable to disinformation?
Yes, I think the first thing I would say is over history, there have been times when people said, oh, that's a conspiracy. And then we actually found out that something bad was happening. So there is a need sometimes for us to ask questions. And so that also means that people say, well, look at, the reason that we're worried about big pharmaceutical companies is because in the past, there have been times when they have acted in a way that's unethical. So we do have to recognize that at first. But you're right, there is now much more of a trend towards people moving towards conspiracy theories. And to your point, we need to use empathy. So rather than saying, I'm sorry, you just shouldn't believe that, like, that's silly. Let me give you an article from the New York Times that proves you're wrong. Like, that's the worst thing that we could do. Instead, is to say, I similarly ask, I'm scared right now. I'm frightened about what's happening in the world. I'd love to talk to you about ways that we can understand what's happening. Talk to me about where is it that you're finding your information? I want to understand and really listen, really hear what they're saying about why this type of information is appealing to them, and just talk about their fears, their anxieties, and try and get to the source of the information. And so rather than trying to say that information is wrong, look to the sources that they're reading. So if they're saying, I found a YouTube channel and everything they say is true, well, find that YouTube channel, find who the source is, and maybe try and do some investigations to say, well, look, that person, they've got a website, they're trying to sell stuff. Like, I'm just a bit worried that this person might be trying to push these ideas, not because they believe them, but because they're trying to manipulate people into buying something. So it's much more effective to try and talk about the source rather than the content of the information. But all of the conversations should be with empathy. It should be about listening to somebody's fears and saying, I understand why you feel like that. And I don't think we're having those kind of conversations now.
Disinformation is linked to fake, but also to hate. How can we tackle this hate problem?
So again, so much of this comes down to psychology. And when we look at kind of very primeval psychology, it's about, are you in my tribe or are you a different tribe? And when people are scared and frightened, they turn towards people who look like them, think like them, because there's safety in that worldview. And so unfortunately, as the world feels more uncertain, as people are more nervous about their jobs, their security, their health, unfortunately, we're seeing the same turn towards people becoming more tribal. We're seeing that people becoming more nationalistic, the growth of populism. It's all about, I don't trust the other. I don't want the other because I feel uncertain, and that's going, rather than celebrating what would that mean, instead people are frightened and they're turning inwards. And so some of the misinformation we're seeing is also hate. It's, I would argue some of this is hate speech, and it's using misinformation to push ideas about others, whether or not it's about their nationality, religion, ethnicity, sexuality. All these different things are being used as a way to try and make people frightened about those who look or think differently to them.
Memes and disinformation are simple and are cool, and sometimes rigorous information is complex and is boring. How can we make facts more engaging?
So I think there's two things to this, which is you're absolutely right. Those people who work in the quality information space love words, really love a lot of words. And so we tend to have lots of PDFs, we have lots of long articles, and those people who are pushing false or misleading information understand that the world is increasingly visual. And that is partly because of these, but many people now live on an internet that's very, very visual. But those who, work in quality information have been trained to write and then write more, and they feel uncomfortable with visuals. They think it's too simple. But again, the way our minds work is we are driven by emotion. Humans have an emotional relationship to information, not rational. So even though researchers, journalists, fact checkers, we like to believe that people have a rational relationship and more facts are good. The horrible truth is that as humans, we have an emotional relationship to information, and visuals are more likely to spark that kind of emotional response. So we do have a very asymmetrical playing field that bad actors or conspiracy theorists, they understand this and they are creating very emotive content that's very visual, and we are not on the other side. The second important difference is that those on the quality information side still like to think like gatekeepers. It's very top down, it's very linear, we're going to create the messages and people are going to consume those messages. On this side, it's very participatory. People are doing their own research, they're creating their own memes, their own GIFs, they're creating their own content, and they are networked and they're connected to one another. That's what's happening on this side. Over here, it's linear and it's broadcast and it's very top down, again, which is a real problem. So you take those two things and it's like two different worlds. And until we really, I say we, those of us on the quality information side, until we recalibrate and understand what this new internet looks like, we're in trouble, because we still use the internet like the printing press. We're like, well, we just need another 100 followers on Twitter. We just need more people to like our Facebook page. It's like we need another person to listen to our radio program. It's not participatory. Journalists don't read the comments. Journalists don't really interact on Twitter with anybody other than other journalists. It's not participatory. And over here it is. And I think that's a huge lesson for 2021, that if we don't learn it, we're in trouble.
Yeah, but nowadays fact checkers are answering the disinformation with words and with facts. Are they are they taking a wrong focus, or how can they incorporate this emotional and visual focus?
Actually, one of the best fact checkers in this is Maldita, they are Spanish, and they said exactly this 4 years ago. They said, why are we writing long fact checks? We need to be on WhatsApp. We need to sometimes create ugly memes, or ugly in the sense that they're kind of fun and they use emojis. They understand very much that it needs to be part of culture, and they've had huge success in using techniques that are very similar, you could argue, to those that push bad information. So I think they do extraordinary work and really should be a model for many other fact checkers, because unfortunately many other fact checkers still rely on very traditional techniques, which means that they're not really reaching. They have audiences, but they tend to have audiences of people who are like, yes, I knew I was right. I knew that I had the facts straight. They're not really hitting people who believe things that are false or misleading.
And how have the media contributed to this information disorder?
So the biggest problem is it's very easy for the media to debunk false information because there is an appetite for it. They get clicks on their websites. But what that means is that sometimes the mainstream media have given oxygen to rumors and falsehoods that otherwise wouldn't have gone anywhere, because many bad actors don't have an audience. They're desperately hoping that it will get retweeted or reshared by a celebrity or a politician or the news media. because by doing that, it gives it oxygen. So even when people say, well, they're debunking it, unfortunately, it's a confusing relationship, because simply talking about Hunter Biden or talking about a conspiracy theory like QAnon, then it kind of makes people go, well, what's this? And they start Googling and they start finding things. So it's really challenging for the news media to know how to report on disinformation without kind of doing the work of the bad actors who want the media to amplify.
Mm-hmm. The 2008 crisis also affected the quality of journalism. Has this have a role in disinformation disorder?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've seen in many, many countries a desperate situation over the last 10 years. Many journalists have lost their jobs, many newsrooms have had to close. And there's a relationship between that, which is the growth of misinformation at the time when we've seen a decrease in quality information. So we have to recognize that. And now that newsrooms are struggling for clicks and eyeballs and money, then it means that they often publish too quickly before they have verified information, or they are tempted to run a debunk on something that they found in a small Facebook group because they know it will get clicks. They've even some fact checkers, by running a fact check with a sensational headline, they'll get more Google clicks from Google. So the whole ecosystem to an extent is driven by attention, which is also what's driving false and misleading information. So we can't deny that we talk about the platforms and say the platforms have got an incentive to keep us on there by giving us emotional content. Well, that's tabloid newspapers. It's not as if we can say that news organizations don't have the same considerations when they're creating content. So it is complex.
Disinformation is a complex problem. We need different solutions from different actors. Regarding governments and institutions, what kind of political action or solution can they promote to erode disinformation, but at the same time respect freedom of expression and respect our rights?
So I really struggle with the idea that governments would play a role in regulating content. The number one thing governments could do is to make sure that disinformation doesn't come from their own governments, or politicians don't push false information. So they are not neutral in all of this. And during election campaigns, politicians are some of the worst people for pushing false and misleading information. So that's the number one thing that we have to do. The second thing is that we have almost no independent empirical information about the amount of misinformation and the impact of misinformation. And that's because we don't have access to the data that's locked in the platforms. So they publish their transparency reports and say, we took down 64% of X. Number of retweets dropped by 21%. But we can't independently analyze that because we have to trust the platforms. So the one thing I would like governments to do is to play a role in auditing those kind of transparency reports. We need not everybody's data, but what we do need is an independent body that says, let us audit the kind of search results I get if I search for vaccines. Let me audit what's the average amount of time that a 75-year-old Spanish woman spends on Facebook? I don't know. So, the absence of any kind of data, not just really granular data, but just basic demographic data, we don't have that. So that's the kind of thing that I would like governments to do, rather than talk about regulating content, because that becomes really, really problematic. And I worry that by doing that, the platforms will just pull back and they'll take a sledgehammer to everything, and we will lose very important speech. So when people go, wow, the platform should be doing more. Well, I can give people 100 examples and say, well, what would you do with those 100 examples? And I would not get the same answer from everybody, would have a different answer. So these are not easy questions to decide what to do with speech. And I hope that we have more of those conversations and we bring the public to these conversations. It shouldn't be governments, platforms, academics deciding this. It should be people who use these platforms helping to decide what kind of speech they want to see on these platforms.
Yeah, these the platforms, the big techs are now doing things to fight disinformation, but that it's all about content and regulating the content, or not giving it visibility, or making this content disappear. Do you think they will be more transparent about the algorithms, and what other things must these platforms do?
So we've had 3 or 4 years when the platforms could have done more. We were in a period of self-regulation and they could have done more, and they haven't. So ultimately, I think governments are going to have to put pressure on the platform. So for example, the way that the YouTube recommendation algorithm works, YouTube is not going to just give that out, because that would mean that they would be giving away secrets to TikTok and Instagram. But governments could say, well, how does the recommendation algorithm work if I Google a conspiracy theory? Like, show me how it works around a particular case study. And that's what we need to ask more of, which is to test algorithms. For example, how do algorithms give certain ads to certain people based on their race or location? Those kind of big societal questions are the types of things that governments should force additional transparency from the platforms, because they're not doing it by themselves. So unfortunately, we do need government pressure.
So governments must make sure not to make disinformation themselves, must to demand algorithm transparency. But how about media literacy?
So it's absolutely critical, but we need governments to understand the kind of digital literacy that we need in 2020. So my slight frustration is that there's this idea of media literacy taken from 2005, which is, we need to teach young people how to discern a quality headline. And the young people are like, listen, I'm on Snapchat, I'm on Instagram, I'm on TikTok, and you're telling me how to read a headline from El País? Like, it doesn't work. We need to be teaching young people how algorithms work, why it is they see the things that they see, how their phones are giving away location data, which means they're being targeted by ads based on the shops that they visited. That's the kind of literacy we need to be embedding into curriculum. And if we do that, then we are developing people who understand the ways that they are being manipulated. We need to focus on the technology and the way that people take advantage of that technology to push ideas that are designed to shape the way that we think, not more traditional ideas about, well, when you see something false, this is how you check the image by using Google's reverse search engine. I mean, yes, we need some of that, of course, but we're too focused on the end as opposed to training people about the whole ecosystem that they're living in. And all the research shows that if you inoculate people, which means teaching them the tactics and techniques that are used against them, people are much better at identifying misinformation when they see it in the wild, because there's less of the confirmation bias around the content, because instead you're like, oh, well, I was taught that if I get an SMS that says, my brother works for the government, I've been taught that that's a deliberate tactic to make me trust something. And I see that, and therefore I'm going to be less trustful of this piece of content I receive on SMS. So that's what we should be doing more of, rather than teaching people how to fact check.
We have talked about governments, platforms. What should we do as a society?
So we should be talking to one another about the harm that this is doing to our society. So I think there's this sense of, well, if my uncle posts this on Facebook, I'm just going to mute him. There's this idea that, well, I didn't post it myself, I just shared it. I mean, I didn't post misinformation, I just shared it. It's not a problem. And we need to get to a point where people understand that that's publishing. If I reshare something during a breaking news event that is an image that is wrong and it's from 2006 as opposed to 2020, I've just published something that's false. And if a newspaper did that, I might get fined. So what does it mean if you do it as an individual? And I think we just have to hold each other accountable, so that if our friends and family are sharing conspiracy theories, we have to say, listen, I get it. Like, I'm scared too, But the more that we share this, the more we're becoming divided as a society, the more that we're losing trust in institutions. And the more that happens, the more we're going to slide into a situation that is really, really damaging. And I think rather than saying, oh, it's misinformation, it's Facebook, it's frivolous, it doesn't matter. Look where we are. Look where we are as a planet right now. Many, many countries are horribly divided. People can't talk to their families at the holidays. People are losing family and friends. This is serious. And I think we have to stop believing that misinformation is silly and not a serious matter. It is really serious and it's causing real world harm. And we need to wake up to that fact, I think, as society, to say, what are we going to do about it? Yes, platforms need to do more. Yes, governments need to do more. Yes, educators need to do more. But if we didn't share any of this stuff, we wouldn't have a problem. So society has to be part of the solution.
Aren't we aware enough? Or which kind of...
Well, because many people don't see the false and misleading information as a problem, because that false and misleading information reinforces their worldview. So we need to explain to everybody that it affects the left and the right. It affects you depending on your religion or your demographic situation. And I think we need to use examples when people are being harmed. So when we say, listen, people have lost their lives because they've drunk bleach because they believe that would cure coronavirus. People aren't wearing masks because they don't think they work. And that's leading to huge levels of infection. I mean, there are real obvious ways that we can say this stuff is causing harm, even if people don't think it because they don't believe that masks work. We have to say, look, even if you don't believe this, there are other things that you probably believe and you think it's crazy that the other side doesn't believe it. So it's about meeting people where they are.
And finally, Claire, are you optimistic about facts?
I am long-term optimistic. I think the next few years are going to be pretty difficult. I think we've got a learning curve. And I think that we didn't do enough for the last 4 years. We talked about it, but the platforms didn't take action. Governments didn't really take action. We didn't really invest properly in this space. So I think that we've lost 4 or 5 years when we could have been taking action. I think the next 4 or 5 years, we will see more action and that's going to be good. But I think there's going to be a lag. I do feel optimistic. I wake up every morning, I keep doing this work, but it's going to be a long, long journey. We are never going to solve this. We will never get to a place where we don't have misinformation. But I feel confident that we will get to a place where we have less misinformation and people themselves have learned how to navigate these spaces. And so that type of misinformation gets less traction. That's what I'm confident about. But yes, it's going to take a good, I would say 30 years for us to get there.
Thank you very much for the interview, Claire.
It was my pleasure to have this conversation with you.